Hello everybody, ladies and gentlemen. I think we can start with our breakout session now. I hope you had a great lunch and feel very energized for this panel. Firstly, let me introduce myself. My name is Henry Reigas. I work as a researcher at the NATO CCDCOA's Law and Policy Branch. I'm one of the co-organizers of the conference and also one of the co-editors of this book which you received yesterday. Our session will focus on cyber arms races. So the term itself is very often used by the media, commentators, by politicians to characterize the situation we are in currently. And it's hard to argue against the observation that states and also non-state actors are building up their capabilities and also offensive cyber capabilities. For example, according to research done by Wall Street Journal, over 60 nations are developing or already have some kind of offensive cyber capabilities. In reality, I'd assume that the number is even bigger since having data on this is difficult, and in my view, a certain level of cyber capability should be a part of every nation's toolkit anyway nowadays. So it is clear that we have a cyber build-up. On the one hand, the situation is only natural. It's logical that states and other actors are looking for technologies which would be used to maintain their power or to gain more influence. On the other hand, every time when this issue is discussed, there's this deep feeling of insecurity about it, because we see this rapid build-up while knowing that societies are more and more dependent on technologies. And that's why many have highlighted the need to somehow curb this proliferation or to limit this build-up. Indeed, this is a logical aim, and the first step is to understand the problem in hand, and this is where it gets complicated. I would even say that the problems are they can be even discouraging. So it's easy to say that it's all impossible, and I think Mikko Hyppönen in his keynote mentioned also that we won't see any cyber arms control regimes anytime soon. But researchers like difficult questions, and today we have three panelists who, by the way, all contributed an article to this book. This session is unique in this sense. First of all, we'll have Brandon Valeriano. It was supposed to be Anthony Craig speaking, but he was the co-author of the article as well. Brandon is from the Cardiff University, has published extensively on this topic. He is the supervisor of Anthony, who unfortunately has a stomach flu, but not from this hotel. So don't eat what was it? Rabbit pasta.
It was the rabbit lasagna at the Radisson.
Yeah, rabbit lasagna at the Radisson. Don't eat that. So first we'll hear a broader IR perspective to the question. He'll speak about cyber build-up in the context of states. Then we'll hear from Trey Herr. Trey is a fellow with the Belfer Center Cybersecurity Project at the Harvard Kennedy School. When I added him to the agenda, I used the title Mr., but now he's actually a doctor, as I just found out, so congratulations. And he'll be speaking about the Wassenaar arrangement and the malware ecosystem, so a broader perspective to the question. And Trey's speech will be followed by Markus Maibaum, who is a friend and an ex-colleague. He's been organizing CyCon for years. Now he's here only as a speaker. He holds the title of NATO CCDCOA's ambassador. And he's currently working at the Fraunhofer FKIE in Germany as a researcher. And Markus wrote an article about the traditional arms control methods and their relevance in terms of cyber. And he'll speak about this, and also he'll present his own technical solution to the problem. So we'll really have a multidisciplinary panel, and we'll hear different perspectives. And without further ado, I will give the floor to Brandon.
Okay, thank you. Tony was really excited to give one of his first major presentations, and then unfortunately we decided to eat at the Radisson, and he had the wrap lasagna, and I have not seen him all day. He apparently is stuck in his room, so we all send our thoughts and regards. But I did co-author the paper with him, and I've done extensive work on arms races before. And this goes with the larger trend of research that I'm trying to propagate in the field of cybersecurity, because I think one of the problems we have is there's a lot of extensive claims with not a lot of evidence. I think this has been a tragic kind of dilemma in the cybersecurity field. And there's a lot of knowledge and there's a lot of research that's been done in the international relations community on the connection between theoretical, causal claims and evidence. And I think this is where we need to lead the field in this direction, because I don't think prognostication and basic theoretical development works without evidence. So this is the clear task we have in this field, to ground the things we talk about and what we can know about the world. But figuring out what we can know about the world, but finding data, but collecting evidence is not an easy proposition. If it could be done easily, someone would have done it before already in some ways. This is the focus of Tony's PhD project. This is a major aspect of a major grant we're submitting right now. And what we're trying to do is comprehensively collect information on cyber capabilities, which I'll go over a bit today. But that's the clear question we need to deal with, because there's a lot of claims in the cybersecurity field about offense versus defense, about the nature of cyber power, about the development of leverage and force in the international system, but there's not a lot of evidence about what power, what capabilities states and non-state actors alike have. So of course, we've been calling cyber the fifth domain of warfare. Obviously, cyber is not a distinct domain. It's more of a spectrum in some ways. But you can think of it as domain. It doesn't really matter. It's showing your own personal preference. But there's a lot of hype and hyperbole in this domain, and a lot of talk about cyber Pearl Harbors, about cyber arms races. And the motivating question for our research was exactly what is going on? Is there evidence of this hype-bait perspective? Is there evidence of cyber arms races? 59% of Americans are very concerned about cyber attacks against governments, banks, and corporations. Cyber is now the #2 threat, according to Americans, after terrorism in the latest Pew 2016 poll. It vacillates back and forth between the #1 and #2 threat, probably based on whatever movies released that year, I don't know. 73% of Americans believe cyber terrorism is a critical threat to the United States. And there's also a lot of great research done by a team in Israel and Michael Gross looking at the biological reactions to cyber terror. That there's a physiological impact to the threat that cybersecurity can bring to bear on the individual and the state alike. But the question for us is about cyber arms races. And this is a very clear conceptual question that we need to really dive into, because there's a large, extensive literature in both politics and history on the concept of an arms race. A lot of people believe arms races are central to the majority of international wars that have happened in the system, or at least major power wars that have happened in the systems. Volumes and volumes of books have been written about the development of arms races on the road to war. And the idea that we have to deal with now is this idea that cyber war is igniting a new arms race, as the Washington Post has said, Wall Street Journal has said. A rapid escalation of the cyber arms race. We are in the middle of the biggest arms race since the Cold War, and one that could lead to a cyber war. 57% of experts agree that this is the truth. But for us, what is the truth? What is the nature of evidence? What could we really know? We need to really investigate and dive into this concept to really understand it. And I think we're making a lot of claims without evidence, which is problematic, because as academics and policymakers, we should be basing policy based on fact. What is an arms race? Well, arms race, first of all, needs two actors, generally two states, but it could be any two entities. There needs to be a mutual rapid military buildup. So, of course, this mutual rapid military buildup must happen at the same time. It must be a race. And, of course, if it is a race, it must be competitive. It must be an action-reaction process. As Lewis Richardson said, the book came out in 1960, but he's famous for being basically a weatherman during World War I. He articulated a lot of the theories that we have now in political science about arms races. And he said it's a mechanical process. You're mechanically compelled to compete and to escalate, and you're driven towards this process, which of course Robert Jervis said, you're driven by the security dilemma and the perception of threat. And the big implication we have in political science, going all the way back to Michael Wallace, who is famous, incidentally, for not being able to replicate his study because he did it on punch cards and he dropped them. But others have followed along later. Susan Sample, Doug Gibler, Paul Sinese, and Vasquez have all found a clear causal connection between arms races and the development of war. And this is the problem, that when you have these weapons, when you're in this context of an arms race, decisions come very quickly. There's a high threat environment, there's tension. There's also the likelihood that you want to use the weapons and the toys you develop in this context. So this is a very, very dangerous situation. And for us, the motivating question is, what is the reality of this prospect in the cyber domain? So does the concept of arms race help explain the behavior in the cyber domain? We are doing here a plausibility probe, basically. We're doing it through 2 case studies. And the ambition is, after this, to continue to collect data on every state actor and non-state actor that it's in our database. I had the book with Maness on Oxford last year, and in that book and in the Journal of Peace Research article, we have presented data on cyber incidents and cyber disputes. We now have collected this data from 2000 to 2014, and there are 166 clear cyber incidents between states. So this serves the bases for a lot of what we're trying to collect and what we're trying to look at. So what we're looking at is dyadically, who is involved in these cyber competitions, and then what can we know about their capabilities? And when we collect data on their capabilities, do we see clear evidence of a mutual and rapid cyber buildup? And do we see evidence of clear competition or rivalry? These are our 2 clear motivating questions. But of course, first though, you should think about where the cyber arms race dynamic comes from. There are a lot of internal mechanisms. The threat environment, the hyperbole that goes along with this environment has led a lot of people to seek to develop cyber arms capabilities. There, of course, is the military-industrial complex. And there, of course, is, as Richardson has said, the biological kind of imperative that we see sometimes to compete and to react. You know, you can watch generations of nature shows about nature arms races. So what is going on in terms of the cyber domain? Is there really a competition? And where does this competition come from? Now, a lot of competition, particularly in the cyber domain, is based on the aspect of rivalry, the fundamental foundation of historical antagonism and historical hatreds. And this is one of the things that I've been pushing for a long time, is to look at the context of cyber conflict. Because we think of this as its own separate domain, a domain distinct and different, but that's not necessarily the truth. Of course, there's a lot of history brought to bear on all these disputes. And when we collected data on cyber incidents, we found a plethora of data between historical antagonists or rivals. So that's where competition comes from. Now, of course, there is a lot of budgetary data that we can look at, particularly in open societies like the United States, where, of course, there is hidden data on military capabilities, but there are things we can know and things we can codify based on budgets spent. So this is the United States going from 2009 to 2014. This is the budget of the National Cyber Division. So Tony has coded this. Tony is the one collecting most of the data. I'm generally the writer. And this is the DHS budget compared to the National Cyber, the Cybersecurity Division budget. And what we see here is that the DHS has actually, in some ways, in terms of percentage growth, we're seeing a lot more percentage growth for cybersecurity budgets. And the question would be is why? Are we all just building up our cyber capabilities because cyber is such a clear threat? Or is there a context that we need to investigate? Is there a deeper international relations knowledge that we need to understand to understand the dynamics of competition in the cyber domain. Budget of the U.S. Cyber Command over the years, of course, it's escalating. There was a bit of a dip in 2012, but it's been going up since then. And the budget of Cyber Command and Department of Defense compared, we once again see Cybercom's budget percentage growth is escalating compared to the DoD. Now, there's a lot more data in the book. There's a lot more data in the article we have written. And of course, the goal is for us is to collect a comprehensive database that will be open source and public for everyone to use and to investigate and to kind of check our methods in many ways. Now, of course, the competition we have set up here is between the United States and Iran. And one question would be, is the United States directly motivated by the threat of Iran? Some would say that no, there's other threats the United States has to investigate and has to react to. But this is a clear process for all of the arms race research. It's never exactly clear who you're racing against. But in the article, we delineate a lot of research that suggests that there is a clear reaction to Iran, and of course, Iran is reacting to the United States in many ways. Of course, we have the example of Stuxnet, which has become the cybersecurity World War I, the case everyone wants to talk about. But then, of course, you also have the reaction of Shamoon and other things Iran has done since then. So here you see the growth of Iran's cybersecurity budget through the years. Now, there is limited information, but for an intrepid researcher like Tony, there's a lot for him to do in the next 2 years to investigate and try and find as much source data as he can about spending on military capabilities in the cyber domain. There have been, and this is a bit of an update of the data. In the book, we have 6 disputes initiated by the United States and 1 by Iran. In the recent data update, we have added 5 more. So now we have actual parity and equality. We have 6 disputes initiated by the United States and 6 disputes initiated by Iran. So there is a clear competition. There's a clear cyber rivalry in many senses. Now, Iran's cyber security budget and ITC budgets compared here. And here you see, of course, that the cybersecurity budget is escalating at a great percentage. And this is the thing that we need to really investigate in terms of cyber arms races. In conventional arms races, some people codify it as 8% increase in 1 year, that is a rapid military buildup. Because we're talking about billions, if not trillions of dollars. So a small percentage increase can be very, very important. And of course, I live in the UK, and we've seen a small percentage increase down every year. In the United States, you see a small percentage increase up every year, but we've seen rapid growth in the cyber domain, which should suggest that we are in an era of cyber arms races. But I think we need to think more about context and how the relationship between Iran and the United States has developed into this situation. Now, the other case we have is South Korea and North Korea. And here we have the claims about hackers, the claims about cybersecurity professionals being developed in North Korea. This comes, of course, from defectors, so reliability is a question. But we've seen a clear increase through the years of the number of hackers in North Korea. Now, for a reaction, we also have to look at defense. When you're trying to look at capabilities, you have to look at technological spending, offensive spending, and defensive spending. And one way we look at defensive spending is looking at secure internet servers, which comes from World Bank data. And here we see that South Korea has rapidly grown in terms of spending on secure servers. And they do this for protection. They do this for security. They do this for safety from the relentless attacks that, of course, come from North Korea. So North Korea, we see 11 initiated attacks from North Korea in our data set, and only 2 initiated from South Korea. So this is more of a reaction process where South Korea is taking punishment and in many ways restraining themselves from reacting. It's a rivalry relationship, but it doesn't necessarily mean that both sides of the rivalry have to fight back. It's more about perception of threat and perception of animosity, which of course is very, very clear in the North Korea and South Korea case. So we have 13 incidents overall over the years. What do we know? Well, one thing we do know is that There is some analytical leverage to be gained by investigating the concept of cyber arms races, that we do see some evidence of this, and there is data we can collect, and Tony will be collecting it for the next number of years. Both cases we have investigated meet this criteria. We did not pre-select these cases. These cases were selected after we decided to write this article, and of course, we actually found more information as time went on after the book was kind of published. We think external threats motivate the buildup of cyber capabilities, and this is clearly delineated in the chapter. But future research will include more cases, more data, and also we need to seek to understand more explanations for cyber buildups and their consequences. But do cyber arms races increase the likelihood of conflict? A lot of people would assume that they do, but to us it's an empirical question. To us, it's a question to be investigated more in the future, and that will be the basis of our research, in particular Tony's research, for the next number of years. But we hope to bring evidence and analytical, theoretical, international relations knowledge to the debate. Thank you.
Thank you, Brandon. Just a quick follow-up question. You mentioned future possible case studies, and to me, a cyber arms race is about this action-reaction pattern. Otherwise, it's just this constant spending in new technologies.
Mm-hmm.
So where else do you see this action-reaction pattern appearing?
Well, particularly, a key case would, of course, be Russia and NATO countries, so that's a key case we need to look into. But also, we need to think about traditional rivals like India and Pakistan. You see a lot of the same dynamics in North Korea, South Korea case in India and Pakistan, where one side's attacking and one side is being attacked. So that's another clear case we need to investigate. But we're going to look at this for all cases and see which ones clearly show these action-reaction processes and which ones don't, because we don't know yet. And we can't assume in this field that we know things without actually really investigating them. The problem is finding information and data is difficult and it's tough. But I think, of course, it's worthy of Tony's PhD project. So it's a clear, ambitious project that he is committed to for the next number of years.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. We will take questions after all the presentations. And now, Trey.
Thanks, Henry, and thanks for the center for putting this together. This is an interesting and timely question. So I have this phrase up here, malware counterproliferation, which is not arms control. Why is that? Why we have a panel titled Arms Control, and I am talking about counterproliferation. Arms control traditionally refers to interstate dynamics, weapons limitation, either qualitatively attempting to curtail the types of tools that states build, or quantitatively the amount, the total tonnage. Going back to the Washington Naval Treaty, right, limiting the size of battleships that could be employed by states. Counterproliferation, proliferation specifically, deals with limiting the utility of capabilities that have already been acquired by states. So we have this counter and non-proliferation dynamic. What do these mean semantically for us? Non-proliferation is an attempt to impose some block to prevent the acquisition of capabilities by a state or by a group. Counter-proliferation is an attempt to deal with that acquisition after the fact, right, to reduce their utility or to counter them in some way. Arms control is a useful frame to a point for what we're talking about, but has limitations largely because, A, there's a complex ecosystem of products, right, the malicious tools underlying our discussions. The second is that non-state actors play a critical role. So let's move, I think, into this counterproliferation issue and get into what exactly we're talking about. The talk's going to kind of focus on 5 basic ideas. What is counterproliferation of malware? How do we get here? Talking about the Wassenaar arrangement, which has been the focus for a lot of these proliferation discussions. What is the malware market? What is a weapon when we're talking in this space? What is an arm that we might be trying to control? And what are some key takeaways and unresolved questions? So counterproliferation, focusing on managing the consequences of proliferation, reducing the utility of capabilities after they've been acquired by a state or a non-state group. Counterproliferation in the conventional context talks about impeding the flow of small arms. In the special weapons context, talks about impeding the flow of special weapons materials, tools and technologies used to develop nuclear weapons, biological and chemical weapons. This is the attempt to disrupt the life cycle of a tool, or the life cycle of a technology as it's been acquired by a state. For our purposes, what is malware? Malware can be broken into 3 basic components: the propagation method, exploits, and a payload. The propagation method is the means of moving code from some origin to your target, right? So I have a malicious package. I've got to get it from my machine to your network, right, or to your laptop, your device. The exploits are the tools that are taking advantage of software vulnerabilities, right, weaknesses in your network or your computer, to make the propagation method and the payload have some effect. So I need these tools, I need these exploits in order to gain access to your network, right, in the conventional sense, talking about malicious software. And we can get into the nitty-gritty of there are instances where you don't necessarily need an exploit to gain access to a system if it's been poorly secured, right? There was a recent incident in Ukraine, right, where the actual event itself took place without need for malicious software, without need for an exploit into the control system, right, once the attackers had gained access to the system itself. And the third component is the payload. What's the thing that I'm actually trying to do? What's the reason for all this work and all this energy, all this time, this money, and this effort, right? This could be simple like a keylogger, right? I want to get onto your laptop and record the keystrokes when you're typing in your Word document or entering your passwords into different websites. It could be something incredibly complex like Stuxnet, right, to actually impede the operation of mechanical devices, to cause physical destruction. So we have these three kind of basic components talking about what malware is, right? And we're talking about countering the proliferation of these tools. So how do we get to here? The Wassenaar arrangement is a multilateral export control regime. Very simply, it's a vehicle for states to come together and to harmonize their export control laws related to sensitive products, dual-use items, items which have a nominal civilian purpose but could also be used in a military context. It's not a binding regime, it's a voluntary regime. And what it allows for states to do is to come together and agree to a certain set of rules so that when they go home, when they impose those rules on companies and individuals, those companies and individuals can then not just simply move to another state or jurisdiction in order to find an easier set of rules to deal with, right? What's called regulatory arbitrage, to prevent them from just hopping from state to state. Wassenaar was originally created in 1996, has about 36 member states. But our history, our recent sort of interesting history, starts in 2013 when the UK and French governments proposed a change to add a new item, two new items, but one of interest to us, to the control list for Wassenaar, covering what was called intrusion software. This is software that was intended to bypass defensive countermeasures and either steal or alter data on a system or somehow modify its process, right? So what they define as intrusion software has either a malicious function or some sort of espionage or surveillance function. Now, the controls didn't actually restrict intrusion software. They actually targeted the devices, the technologies, or the software used to build that software, right, or to control it, or for our purposes, to propagate it, right, from targets to their origin. So the controls themselves aren't controlling malware, they're controlling the sort of supporting infrastructure, the communications infrastructure, the development tools. The targeted technologies controls used to build and control these type of software range in complexity vastly, but the rules are intended to apply fairly broadly. The effect of this is such that it ended up in the implementation that was announced by a number of different states, but the majority of the brouhaha was started in the United States, and the implementation of the rules proposed by the Department of Commerce in 2015. That implementation potentially impacted a number of defensive security processes, as well as these surveillance tools, as was kind of the original focus of the controls. So we have this question of how do we get to where we are? What are we talking about with Wassenaar? Fundamentally, an export control regime targeted at dual-use technologies that's now been applied to software tools, software mechanisms. Why does the malware market matter, and what is it? What are we talking about? Wassenaar is attempting to restrict the flow of malicious software to groups of concern, states or non-state actors that we, as a collective group, would not want to have certain types of capabilities. The malware market is the ecosystem in which these groups acquire, trade, and use these capabilities. So it's relevant for our discussion because it's the exact life cycle, it's the arrangement, the system that we're attempting to restrict with Wassenaar. So sort of three big chunks we want to talk about when we talk about this market. The first are the type of actors. Who is buying, who's selling, right? For us, we have two sort of main groups on the supply side. We have groups that are selling individual components, these propagation methods, exploits, and payloads, as well as groups that sell fully developed services like Hacking Team. Right? Hacking Team wasn't selling individual components to governments. They were building all these tools together and selling them as a complete package, right, to some groups that had very little capability to use them. So they tried to make them as user-friendly as possible. Right? The same process that standard commercial software development companies go through. Sellers range from state groups to non-state groups, companies like vendors who have an active interest in the security of their software, as well as information security groups who are attempting to gain this information for some sort of tactical advantage. Market forces, supply and demand, reputation, and trust. Right? This is a market like any other. Buyers are attempting to understand the products they're purchasing. They want to make sure that they don't purchase lemons, right, or bad goods. They want to have information that's still useful for them. Sellers are attempting to sell their products in a way that's financially advantageous. They don't want to give something away for no cost. So you have these issues of how you establish reputation and trust in the market. Who do I know? How do I trust that they're a legitimate actor? That they're not a law enforcement agent, for example, or they're not going to take my good and steal it. And then we have the structure of the market. Nominally, this is a set of online interactions, right? Forums, web servers, person-to-person encrypted email. There's a variety of forms that this market takes, but it's linked by these common products, right? It has both defensive and offensive actors in it. If I am a national intelligence agency, and I'd like to acquire a particularly unusual exploit for a small piece of software, right? Something that might be difficult to actually acquire, a well-secure piece of software, I could go onto this market and pay millions of dollars for it. Right. That's going to impact the number of buyers and sellers in that space. Am I competing with somebody else, the company that manufactures the software, for example, who's also looking for that information to secure their software? Does that fact that I've paid many millions for this piece of information potentially bring new sellers into the market? Somebody says, hey, this is a great deal. I'm going to come in and I'm going to start to build these tools. I'm going to start to build these exploits of these payloads. But there's also defenders, right? Vendors live in this market. Google, Microsoft have been running bug bounty programs for years. And these bug bounties, which are essentially forms to purchase exploit information so that they can be corrected or patched in software, are competing with groups for this exact same information. I would talk about exploits a lot in this process, not because they're necessarily the only thing out there or the most interesting thing out there, but they are central in that exploits take advantage of information about a piece of software. I know of a hole or a weakness, a flaw. Could be an intentional feature that was poorly designed or something that was an actual flaw, a mistake by a programmer. These exploits take advantage of those vulnerabilities to gain access to a system, whether well protected or not. They are fundamentally information, which means if I have it, I don't necessarily have exclusive control of it. Right? If I discover an interesting vulnerability, you could also do the same the next day. Right? And you may not want to use it maliciously. You might disclose it to the vendor, which has that impact on price. So that's one of the challenges in this market is you're focusing on exploits, trying to turn your product over fairly quickly, or else its market value starts to decline. But it also means, going back to Wassenaar, that we don't have strong, tangible goods that could be controlled and tracked. Right? The flow of these goods are happening in the same sort of flow of information that when you're shopping on Amazon, right, or browsing on Google. Right? This indistinguishable digital data that's flowing around the web. So the structure of the market is sort of a nominal thing. These are websites and interactions taking place all over the world. But they're linked by this common thread, these common goods. 3 key processes in this market. The first is reuptake. What is this? Reuptake. One of the virtues of a piece of software is I can try to understand it, even if I didn't write it. I can build it into my own tool set. I can adapt it to my own needs. Reuptake is essentially reuse. Now, what's the problem here? What's the complexity? Well, if I develop a really sophisticated tool and I put it out into the wild for my own ends, that means I've given that tool not only to the opponent that I put that on their system, right, but anybody else who discovers that code later. There was a reference made to the Duku espionage platform, right, which was developed most likely by the United States to target Iran. Duku was a sophisticated modular espionage package, and when it was disclosed, it included several exploits which were known as 0 days. Essentially, they were unknown to the community at large, especially the vendor who had no chance to patch them. Less than a year after the disclosure, one of these exploits, a particularly nasty kernel-level bug, was discovered in several exploit kits. Exploit kits are commercially available criminal packages that if I present to you a payload, I want to steal banking information from somebody, I go to you, you rent me time on that exploit kit, and you punch it out to thousands, if not tens of thousands of computers on the web. These exploit kits had integrated a piece of technology that had been developed by a state for a national intelligence capability. In less than a year, they closed that loop. They were able to reuptake that exploit and adapt it into their own tool set. And there are numerous examples of elements like this. Now, this reuptake process can be more complex when we start talking about payloads. Right? Something like Stuxnet required a great deal of specific knowledge and sort of dedicated engineering time. You wouldn't be able to take it, talking to these very specific Siemens PLCs, and turn around and use it against a hydroelectric dam, right? A radically different piece of infrastructure. But this reuptake process is important because, again, this is fundamentally information, right? Rarely these tangible goods. The 2 others I'm going to go through very quickly are the patching cycle. If I'm a vendor and I want to correct my software, I have to, if I find a vulnerability, make some change to it. Once I've made that change, right, I've done nobody any good yet. I have to get that change out into the wild. And then as a third step, they have to implement that change on their system. Those 3 separate steps all take time. They all take some user or some group of some organization acknowledging a problem and trying to solve it, right? And at multiple instances, that patching cycle can get hung up. It's not enough if Google creates a solution. It's not enough if Google simply puts the solution out there. You have to apply it to your machine as well. Right? Last year's Verizon Data Breach Investigation Report said that 90+% of attacks took place against vulnerabilities for which a patch existed, in several cases for more than a year. So this patching cycle becomes really critical when we're talking about the availability of these information goods in this marketplace. Third and finally, we have vulnerability discovery and disclosure. I'll show you guys a short graph here. This is where Vasanar, coming back to this for a second, really starts to fall flat. If I'm trying to restrict the flow of malicious goods to actors I don't like, right? I want to target the side of this pool, and this is a simplified framework to be sure, but I want to target the side of this pool that's moving those goods towards malicious software, not the side that's moving towards the patching process, right? The patching process secures the software you use every day. The malicious software side creates tools, right? Again, a simplified framework, but creates the tools that are used to attack the software you use every day. The problem is that for the arrangement, the way it's currently structured, it targets this process at the very top of the waterfall before it's been about to split into patch and malware. Right? So we have this limitation in terms of it blocking the vulnerability discovery and disclosure process for potentially useful tools. So we come back to this arms control theme, right? We've had a lot of discussion about software and tools and payloads and what is all this stuff, right? Fundamentally, the tools we're talking about, the weapons we're talking about are software code, right? I think a weapon is something that has to break or disrupt. There are others who disagree. And there's a lot of conversation and debate about what a weapon is. You can have destructive effects. They're incredibly uncommon, right? They haven't happened a lot, but they're happening at increasing frequency, right? You don't necessarily have to be a massive computer whiz to create destructive effects on a physical device. It helps. It helps if you have decades of experience. It helps if you have direct access to the system, but it doesn't necessarily have to be the case. And it is scary how much you can learn online, right? A lot of these industrial control system vendors have strange proprietary software and use, odd orders of logic and their own kind of proprietary networking protocols, but you can learn a tremendous amount about these things just clicking around on the web, right? So we have this question of what is a weapon. I would submit to you that if it has to destroy or disrupt, it's a fairly small percentage of malware that we've seen so far. And when we're talking about destructive effects, especially for industrial control systems, let's take the power grid. There's a much bigger predator out there, a much more substantial problem than a tool made from software or hardware that we haven't really addressed yet. This guy. The squirrel has caused more damage to power grid, electrical transmission facilities, and ICS vendors in the electrical industry than any piece of malicious software yet, even counting the black energy attacks last year. Right? I had a project for a small group in the defense community last year, and one of the things we worked on for them with these hydroelectric owner-operators was attempting to build a physical and sort of cyber security risk assessment module. And when we got to the end of it, there was very little interest in using it. They said it didn't really solve the main problem we have. People keep stealing our copper wire. And that is 90% of our security effort. That is most of what we spend our time on. So all this is very nice, all this are network security protocols and all these things you built, but doesn't solve the physical security problem for us, which is people cut the wires into the building, they steal these big tubes of copper cable, and they sell them. What is a weapon matters for this discussion? Because when we're talking about arms control, when we're talking about counterproliferation, we need to have a great deal of focus on the tool that we're trying to counter its proliferation or to control. So I'll leave you with a couple of key things. What are our goals? When we're talking about proliferation, are we primarily interested in state-to-state proliferation of tools? State to non-state proliferation, or non-state to non-state? Do I care more if Russia builds a tool and loans it to somebody, or if they use a tool and give it to another state, right? Or if somebody develops a really great capabilities in non-state groups and just sticks it out on the web? What's my primary concern? Because those are three very different scenarios, and they require very different institutional responses. Key takeaways for us. Export controls target only part of the malware market and product lifecycle, right? But they have impact on both offensive and defensive processes. And this market has both offensive and defensive actors in it, so we have to take that into consideration. It is not easy to tell good code from bad code, right, until it executes. And that's a long way down the life cycle. The last point is, do we know enough about this ecosystem to really understand and build good policy about it? I would submit to you no. That our level of scholarship, talking about the need for analytic rigor and data collection, our journey into this understanding is incredibly early. It's incredibly rudimentary. It's a problem that can be solved with effort and time, but it's something that we have to understand in order to craft solid public policy around it. That's the talk.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Just, yeah. Before Marcus goes on, just a quick follow-up question. So you approached this question of proliferation from the market side, and in my view, limiting the activities of states at the moment is rather unrealistic. So do you think this method to approach it from the market side, and you'll see that actors are more open about their capabilities as well. They're advertising their capabilities actually. So do you think this is a more rational way how to at least achieve some counter-proliferation.
So what I get into in the paper, and so what I didn't have a chance to do in the talk, is that when we start talking about proliferation, a lot of our interest is in that these tools are useful, and we'd like to prevent them from being used successfully. And that segmentation is really narrow when you're talking about a kinetic tool. I drop a bomb, heat and overpressure, it has its effect. With a software tool, though, coming back to those vulnerabilities and exploits, I can deny the attacker the ability to use their tool if I take out a critical piece of that tool, right? If I'm able to patch a vulnerability in their tool before they use it, right, or before they have able to generate some great effect with it. Looking at this ecosystem, my argument, my contention would be that it is we're going to be more successful countering proliferation, thinking about it as defensively, and attempting to remove these kind of critical pieces of information from attackers' toolkits, rather than trying to block their flow around this larger ecosystem. So thinking about it as a market forces us to consider that these defensive actors exist, and that this defensive life cycle exists. So potentially focusing on that as opposed to this purely offensive side. That said, state to state is complicated. Not everybody has to buy this kit, absolutely, and a lot of this development, really interesting stuff, is being done within these closed systems. So the market is by no means a panacea.
Okay, thank you. Marcus, you're up.
Yeah, thank you very much already for this very inspiring talk, which actually brings us to the point something needs to be done, because we already learned from Brandon in the first talk, there must be done something about the arms race. We learned from the past already that an arms race is costly, that it doesn't really have a winner in the end, and that it's good to start very soon with measures, and we found arms control as a very good tool of security policy to actually improve the situation and to come to an end of a senseless arms race. So when we already introduced the Wassenaar Agreement, which is more a kind of voluntary thing. What we did in our research is actually we looked at the more binding treaties. So this is a kind of list of the treaties we looked at. In the paper we discussed three treaties in particular, which were the CFE, in combined with the Vienna document, the Open Skies Agreement, and the Chemical Weapon Convention. I will not go into the details here. I will just come up with our findings. If you want to see the analysis, please read the paper in the book. So lessons that we can tell from the research that we did, that actually there is three major bullets that we have to see when we analyze traditional arms control that makes this concept work. First of all, let's remember what was the basic idea of arms control. Arms control in the 80s and even before was invented to reduce risk, the risk of war, to risk of the escalation of a conflict, to something that nobody really wants, especially not in a nuclear scenario. So this is also basically what the first contracts were doing then. So what was done, actually, we were counting weapons. We were counting weapons, we were informing each other about what weapons we have, and we were then comparing the output of these information exchanges with what we really have as information. So with CFE, we started really counting physical weapons with open skies. We took air pictures, flew over countries and counted. What was the reason behind this? The reason was quite easy. We wanted to have a kind of early warning mechanism. And if we cannot have this mechanism, at least talk about how we can have such a mechanism. And this is actually the same what we also need in cyber nowadays. So we need a kind of warning mechanism, and we need to talk about how we can actually do this. As we said, traditional arms control was more or less an answer to the escalation strategy, so it was made to de-escalate conflicts. Building trust and confidence was the message, and actually the big common goal was, as Mikko already said in his inspiring speech this morning, not only to make IT systems better, to make war systems better, to make the scenarios better, just to make the world a better place. And we want to follow this approach with the proposals that we want to make today. So how can we actually translate these findings from the traditional world into this world of cyber? So we learned from your simple scenario already that this is about delivering a malware, it is about exploitation, and it's then about executing a malware and doing some malicious stuff. We use this cyber kill chain model for explanation. So if I now go to these basic findings, this counting and comparing, where the challenge is simply to identify an arm, in the cyber world, I would have to have a look at a weapon production facility. Unfortunately, there is none. Not a typical cyber weapon production facility. The problem is, a cyber weapon I can hide more or less until the microsecond before it's being executed. So this simply doesn't work. The other thing is this early warning function that cyber arms control should basically have. This is then about seeing weapons movement, what Vienna document was actually doing, looking that troops are being moved, that arms are being set up, finding errors somewhere, which is also difficult. We can do this, of course, with backbone analysis. We can use IDS systems. But in principle, this is really hard to achieve as well. Let's have a close look at how arms control in a traditional way was organized. It was a security policy function. Well, yeah, implementation was done by the military, but actually it was done on a political layer way before we talk about a conflict or even a war. In a cyber scenario, it would therefore be already from the traditional point of view a phase before we talk about cyber defense. So we have a clear split here from the traditional point of view. If we have a look at the nature of a cyber weapon, and I now compare this now to a kind of air scenario. If we have an air scenario, there is a bomber coming somewhere, dropping his missile, and it will explode in a bunker if the missile is good enough for that. If we see this now in terms of cyber with a cyber force, yeah, we need an attacking system. We need a carrier somewhere, which is usually our network, can also be a USB stick or something. Then we need to penetrate a firewall. Of course, try to hit the target system and bring the malware to execution. Quite simple model. So if I have this in mind, I see already it is about the exploitation, as you already quite good mentioned. So, and actually when I need to build confidence, trust, and verification in an arms control scenario for cyberspace, if I see this in a traditional scenario, I had the chance to gain trust by verification. There was something on the ground I could count, or there were photos I could do which I could evaluate. In cyberspace, there is nothing to count, and there is no photos I could take to evaluate. The problem is the trust must come out of the environment already. So what do I need for confidence building is actually a verifiable environment which I can trust to bring out the trust functionality. That means if I go back to this kill chain model, in a cyber arms control regime, I need to extend my scope. Now, having in mind what the current approach was, seeing cyber arms control as a phase before a defense scenario, this is way too early. You see already this little arrow counting and comparing moved way to the right. The early warning function, finding an arm in execution in the cyber engagement zone, this works in the delivery or in the beginning of the exploitation phase. This is when I can analyze my network traffic. This is when my cyber defense systems being installed locally on my machines have the chance to find a malware. Okay, we all know we only find a maximum between 50 and 70%, because the rest we don't know that's the 0 days. And the counting and comparing, for this I need to have found the cyber weapon first. So I can only do that at a very, very late stage, end of delivery, or when I see the exploitation happening. The thing is, I must find this before engagement, because when engagement starts, I am in the defense scenario. So here, the arms control part needs to be extended to the right into the delivery phase until almost into the exploitation phase, which means we have a cut set, an intersection now between arms control and cyber defense. So from an architectural perspective, I already told we need a trusted environment. So what kind of trusted environment do we know nowadays? So we found a very good example. Now moving a little bit to the technical side. So the standard architecture nowadays used as a so-called trusted environment is trusted computing. It's a whitelisting approach. That means we start giving digital signatures to our BIOS, to our operating system components, up into the single application. The problem is that we have with trusted computing at the moment being that this entire process is only implemented in hardware, so we can check some the BIOS, and in files, so we can check some files. The problem is as soon as we go into the volatile memory, these things do not actually work anymore, because this is where exploitation takes place. I exploit my files in the memory, and this is where it is not under control of trusted computing anymore. So what is the easiest idea? I have to extend my trusted computing functionality, and this is a system we introduced last year already on a German conference, which we call trusted control flow integrity. That means we now combine those two concepts. Control flow integrity, monitoring the control flow of a program, and trusted computing, which bears a trust based on digital signatures. So how does a malware exploitation usually work? Here on the right side, you see a typical program control flow, and if an exploit comes in, it is usually deviated into the execution of a malware by some exploitation vector which is being executed. For the moment being, what is our only defense that we have? Yeah, well, recognition mechanisms, and on the other hand, it's this pure little defender, the corporate cyber defender that we have. Yeah, I put him into this ancient outfit, medieval, okay, but this is how it actually feels at the moment to be. Against the sophisticated malware, this is the only concept that we have at the moment, not really strong. But I'm not here without offering a solution to a problem. Now moving forward to what we think is a good approach. We thought we need a trusted environment. We call it actually a future advanced trusted environment. This means we want to enhance the trusted computing platform. We want to enhance the TPM. What you see here is a layout structure of the trusted platform module. Maybe not all of you have seen this before. This is actually the implementation of trusted computing, what we have seen so far. And what we want to add is, first of all, this control flow integrity function, and even more interesting, that we give it a network dimension. So trusted computing is not executed on a system standalone anymore, but we create networks of any scope and of any size, so it's very scalable between the trusted platform modules. So the security is then created and achieved between single chip modules. So everything between the trusted chips is considered to be unsafe. That means the real trusted communication will be between trusted platform modules. So we call this an attack or cyber arm recognition module. And actually, this is, from our perspectives, the only reliable way forward to go ahead, because any software I would put in place, and I know the software industry that produces IDS systems do not really like this idea, but I keep saying, also, if you have a software product that you use to protect your systems and to establish such a trusted environment, it is still software and can be exploited. So we need to be hardware-born, and of course, in terms of verification, we need to be fully transparent. That's the good thing is the TPM is kind of open source. Everybody knows how it's created. The only thing is, of course, yeah, you could manipulate the hardware, as we learned in yesterday's afternoon presentation about hardware Trojans. This is something which needs to be monitored in the production process of the chip. There is no other workaround. The important point is, with this system, I can identify any malicious modification of the program control flow. How is this achieved? This can already be done by compile time. At the compile time of a program, of any module of my system, I have all the important information that I need. So I can put this metadata, branch tables, for example, into the files, and this also works with existing software, because simply I would just have to recompile it for this new hardware platform. And with this metadata, I can actually check each and every branch, if this is a kind of legal branch or if it's branching somewhere else. And if there is a branch to somewhere else, this can of course be technical malfunction, but in 99% of cases, this will then be a malicious activity. And this is how we actually identify the cyber weapon. At this moment, I don't care yet about any attribution, and I don't know yet if it's really a cyber weapon. I only have the suspect could be a cyber weapon, and from this step on, I could go into forensics, because I cannot stop executing the process. I can make a dump of the memory. This is what we here see as trusted forensics. This is now where the verification process can actually start. So this is where designers can now go, so software engineers and security analysts can meet and have a look together at what actually is happening there, identifying whether or not whatever we have seen is a cyber weapon or if it's just a mistake. The problem is now how to establish this on a really national level. So first of all, what we need is, of course, a kind of common consolidated cybersecurity picture, arms control picture, however we want to see, we want to call it. We need some kind of situational awareness at different granularity levels on states. This could be started at an ISP, and then at an internet service provider, and then more or less be assembled in a kind of national authority that have a kind of common picture about a nation, and then we can bring this even further into the level of international organizations, but this is of course a dream to the very far future. I have a dream. No. Actually, so the easiest thing in this situation is if every future chip that has a TPM and any hardware platform that has a TPM in future could be voluntarily join such a system, we could actually have a situation when we can see on any granularity level if there is a kind of intended approach to deviate control flow to execute a malware. And that's the point behind. The peer communication is the important part with this, so we need to make sure that this is really secure and reliable. So this can be done. This is always in a competitive situation because there is then this race between security system and the malware, so we have to be quite quick. This is why we implemented this at layer 2. We called it Trusted ARP. It's a very secure ARP layer protocol, which is actually then the enabler on the technical level. So IP is usually the common protocol which is used internet-wise. We go one level below that, just to be fast enough and be competitive in the protocol stack layer. Last but not least, okay, we cannot guarantee that we see everything. This is only related to cyber weapons, which are exploit related, which is kind of 99% of the malware markets. There are still those attack vectors where you just do attacks by modifying data, and by this executing malicious functionality, which may be implemented before in the malware, so this is sleeping malware, which is kind of in the program already and just being executed by submitting a certain code sequence, and also not just simply wrong, faulty programs, which by entering wrong data execute some malicious function. Anyway, this is our suggestions to solve this thing technically. Of course, there is a lot of challenges if we want to implement this on a political level, but I think there is much space to discuss this here in the plenary, and I'm open for your questions.
Thank you.
Dangerous to walk here.
Yeah, you mentioned challenges. The system looks very promising, but how would you go about convincing, first of all, the states and then also the private sector to adopt this technology?
Yeah, the very first step is, of course, I already convinced the audience. No, nine. The point is, of course, this is now a technical invention. So we need to go, of course, through an international evaluation process, so everybody needs to see. That's what I meant with transparency. The good thing is with the trusted computing approach, that is anyway an international approach. So the Chinese are in, the Russians are in. Everybody knows more or less trusted computing already and how it works. So the process of going now into this advanced trusted computing platform must be very transparent. So an idea would, for example, like we had it with the Chemical Weapon Convention, to have an international board, international organization that would kind of take over control over and monitor the development and kind of be a responsible executive body to bring this from the blueprints to an existing prototype.
Mm-hmm. It would be interesting to hear thoughts by others as well, but we'll have a Q&A later. But what about involving the private sector in adopting these solutions?
Well,
because there's a cost.
You may know or you may not know, but most of your systems will have a TPM already, and within the renovation process, you will get a TPM of the next generation with the new hardware that you buy anyway. So far, there is not much applications actually using the TPM. One that you might know is the BitLocker, which actually protects your computer system. But so the operating systems are prepared already. The hardware is anyway on your system. Just with the next regeneration of hardware, you will get then the new version of the TPM chip, and then it's about implementing things on operational level, on organizational level, and of course, yeah, we could start something like with the Wassenaar as a voluntary contribution. Some other countries might put some more pressures behind it, but this is then the political decision.
Okay, but thank you. If I understand correctly, in order it to work, it would have to be universally adopted, or
the point is you start to be compatible to the system as soon as you have this new chip and this is implemented. Unfortunately, there is no downward compatibility. So it is a thing we have to grow into.
Okay.
So old systems, unfortunately not.
Thank you for the presentations, all of you three. Maybe I'll just start off the discussion with a more general question. Reading your and editing your articles as well, I saw this common thread where we actually should basically drop the traditional idea of having any cyber arms control on the state level. And now Marcus proposed a technical method which could be implemented through technical means. And Trey also mentioned the limitations, or mentioned that the solution is rather on the cybersecurity research level. So what do you think we should basically forget the notion of a cyber arms control on the state level and focus on alternative solutions in approaching this issue?
It's not unreasonable to talk about qualitative distinctions between tools. And I think that's a useful and emerging part for the information security research community, is to start to articulate these architectural distinctions between tools, these capability distinctions, in ways that are not isolated to the tool themselves. You know, this package does this thing, you know, to actually see them as families and start to see them evolving over time. But to treat software as an arm, as a tangible good to be developed and restricted in that way, I think is limiting, not just because non-states are involved, not just because there is this active, you know, sort of research community, but it doesn't fit our models for verification and transparency and enforcement when we talk about arms control. It's difficult, as Marcus pointed out, it's difficult to fly overhead and count silos, right, and to count bombers on the ground. But it's also difficult to verify, even if there is some other independent mechanism of establishing a certain fact. It's difficult to verify that that's true. So without a potentially path-breaking amount of sort of international cooperation and a release of responsibility over what is usually a very critical national security issue, right, enforcing arms control arrangements to some international group, I don't think the model fits for us.
Yeah, I've thought a lot about the question. I think one of the problems is that we're trying to fundamentally limit technology. And the same thing is true of drones and AI research, that this is not a realistic proposition. Major powers and actors are going to use technology to try and leverage power. I think what we really need to do, and what I'm moving towards, is start to think about things like cyber repression and trying to name and shame the deviant actors, those actors that are doing things that we can generally all agree are malicious and harmful, like targeting protesters, like targeting activists and journalists. I think that's where we start to build capacity from the ground up. And instead of trying to dictate how the international system should work, we should think about what we all commonly agree on as negative and bad things being done by states and non-state actors alike.
That also, so just as a quick aside, right, that sort of highlights a distinction here in the discussion I don't think we've had a chance to get into as much, which is capabilities versus effects. And when we talk about arms control, we can discuss both. One of the reasons that, or one of the sort of evolving standards for the nuclear arms control, but certainly the Geneva Convention and some of these other restrictions on the use of certain technologies in conflict, is this notion of inhumanity, right, or excessive harm. And so it may be that talking about state-to-state proliferation or within state proliferation it's difficult to force a state to not acquire capabilities independent of some other force or course of power. But we may be able to structure a restriction on the scope of effects that they are nominally able to, right, or sort of seen as legitimate that they can exercise on. I think that's been the focus of a lot of the normative discussions in the GGE process,
Yeah, exactly.
and some of these other international fora.
Yeah, Marcus had comment.
Point that also we can see this as an example is that I would make into support your theory about empowering research is that at the moment being we invest a hell lot of money in IT security products, into establishing structures, into setting up cyber forces at a national level. If we would invest the same sum into the development of a secure backbone, of a secure framework which does not suffer this exploitation, the zero-day problem, I think this would be very, very helpful.
And this relates to my next question. Politicians or the decision makers often use nuclear proliferation as a parallel, and they sometimes use it as a way to understand the problem. And in many cases, it's the assumptions are ill-advised, I would say. So in a way, approaching it from the technical side without getting the politics in may be a solution. But what do you think about the nuclear parallels in this discussion? Are they useful, or do they have the opposite effect?
I think it's generally a horrible comparison. I don't think the domains are generally comparable at all. The only thing that is comparable, I would think, is that in the cyber domain and the nuclear domain, we have a problem in not solving the fundamental issues at heart between states. We kick the can down the road and deal with other things and deal with other types of threats. But in the cyber field, it's not about coercion. It's not about destruction. It's more about disruption and espionage. But we keep talking about it as a conflict or war event when that's not what's really going on. And that's the focus of the next book I have coming out next year on cyber coercion.
What we actually have to learn from the nuclear world is that obviously it doesn't make sense to continue the arms race forever and ever and ever. At some time, you have to come up with a different proposal, with a different solution. And exactly this is the point now with cyber. We keep on investing in cyber forces, exploitation, and so on. This seems again like an endless race, and we must come to a point where we say, we have to stop this, we need our money for different things, and we must come up with a reasonable solution.
So I think, right, the conventional wisdom is the notion of sticking a cyber bomb on the top of a cyber ICBM and launching it at your enemy is sort of a ludicrous notion. But so maybe to play devil's advocate, there are two things potentially that we can learn from the analogy. First is there is an inextricably dual-use nature to the notion of fission. Right? It has tremendous civilian application and is spread around the world. Right? Even very close within 10 years of its initial conception as a military tool, it became a major focal point as well as a civilian technology. And part of the difficulty in controlling and structuring its use as a military technology was because of the civilian application. There is a similar dual use, although I would argue it's more indistinguishability at play here. But the second is, and I think this is important and is lost sometimes, a lot of the critical work on nonproliferation with nuclear weapons was done talking about the nuclear life cycle, the fuel enrichment cycle and its construction process. And we haven't gotten to that point within cybersecurity yet. And I think that would be actually a really valuable sort of next step forward, especially for social science, where we're a little bit scared of the technology, is to try and better understand the underlying development process and sort of break open this black box of how do I get this thing, this tool, whether it's Stuxnet or an espionage package or even a very simple piece of criminal code. What is its gestation cycle, and how do I understand the limits, the practical limits on what can be done in time and skill and resources? So I think that informed a lot of good work on nonproliferation with nuclear weapons, and it could potentially start to see some utility here as well.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Are there any questions from the floor? Yeah. There's Jason here in the front, and then Nigel will be.
Thank you. Jason Healy from Columbia University. I'll break it up into two questions. For Trey, I'm interested in, do you think the approach for the U.S. was different for Wassenaar in approaching the markets because the U.S. has been a buyer on the intelligence community side, and are France or Germany buyers, and has that changed how they work in that space? And for Brandon, I mean, it's interesting to call this an arms race because we don't think of arms races as nations that are in active conflict. I mean, we could talk about an arms race in 1913, but you certainly didn't talk about an arms race in 1913, but not one in 1915. You might have talked about an arms race in 1938, but you didn't talk about an arms race in 1942 because there was an active conflict going on. So how do you pull out those threads of active conflict between North Korea and South Korea and U.S. Iran from the dynamics of an actual conflict?
Brandon, you want to start?
Yeah, I'm surprised we never disagree. So this is a rarity for me. No, I don't think we are in active conflict in the way you're thinking of it. 1913, 1938, these are all rivalry kind of relationships. These are active conflicts, and I think this is kind of a continuation, and it's a spectrum. And of course, you wouldn't want to look at an arms race in the context of war. Generally, in empirical research, we stop at least 6 months before. And I don't think we're in cyber war. I think we're just in cyber conflict, cyber rivalry, whatever. And I think that's what we're trying to look at. We're trying to look at the precursors and try and investigate and see if we can figure out what might be the symptoms of the real problems in the international system. And one of those symptoms would be a clear escalation of a cyber arms race?
So I think it's possible. There's two answers. The first is there's certainly some reason to believe it's the case because one of the changes in the U.S. rules was a required disclosure of the product or the tool, the technology involved, and one of the theories was that given our intelligence community's role in the export control revision process and licensing process, that would give them insight into any new and novel attack techniques or defensive techniques, either advance of the market or whatever relationships they already have with commercial software security vendors, but potentially in advance of other government agents. But I think the better answer is that when you start to dig into the interpersonal process and the interorganizational process by which this came about, it seems to be more of a product of path dependency. We use Wassenaar as a vehicle to control cryptographic technologies as well. It was a successor to an arrangement that had developed in the 1950s called COCOM. It was primarily intended to prevent the flow of technologies to the Warsaw Pact by sort of the willing West. And when Wassenaar came about in '96, we attempted to implement a lot of the same controls on public and private key cryptography using similar key limits and key types into this agreement. It didn't hold very well, it didn't hold very long, although we stood out for years, right, as sort of a unilateral set of export controls in these technologies. So I think the other answer to your question, the one I find a little bit more convincing, is there's this path dependency in the regulatory agencies responsible for looking at these products. And there was some key miscommunications during the initial phase after the plenary session when it was approved before, it took 2 years for Commerce to implement these rules. And I think it's a lot more about what's familiar, not necessarily what's overtly in our interest, but there's certainly evidence on both sides.
Mm-hmm. Marcus, did you have any comments?
Yeah, it's a good point that Brandon actually made, and maybe also in reflection to the discussion on the comparability with the nuclear weapons that we had a minute ago. We can say that nuclear weapons we never saw in action. Okay, we know this 2 times, we have heard today. Cyber weapons are actually a daily problem. We see them every day, we have attacks every day, and this is why we urgently need to start doing something about it. So this is actually the difference where I say we are maybe not in cyber war, but it's kind of cyber war-ish. It is, so conflict is maybe not the right word for this. Maybe we need to find something in between now to define this situation. So obviously it is not bad enough, the situation, that politicians come to a closer change of mindset that we have to talk about something like that we have a real interstate conflict scenario which brings us to the edge of that we talk about something like a war. But it's really a daily problem. Like nukes, this is somewhere very abstract, far away, and actually it's deterrence. And this is actually what's missing in cyber then, the deterrence function.
There was a question here in the front row.
Am I on? Deborah Hausen-Coriel from Tel Aviv University. Thanks to all 3 for very interesting presentations. And my question is, I think, more for the first presenter, but I'd be happy to hear from everybody else. And it goes to the fact that a familiar paradigm from other arms races has been that of the use of proxies. And I'm curious as to whether you had started any mapping of that whole dynamic, proxies as opportunities to try out cyber weapons, to test them, to buy them, to sell them. I'm particularly thinking of development of cyber capacities, not necessarily that may be dual use. For example, China in development of African cyber infrastructure. Is there any thinking, any articulation of that paradigm, the proxy paradigm, in this arms race?
We haven't necessarily looked at it yet, but I think there are clear parallels, and especially if you look at it from the terrorism research, I think this is where the clear analogy would be in looking at terrorist proxies for state actors. But there's a lot of great research being done. Jamie Collier at Oxford is focused on cyber proxies, and for Jay, it's Justin, what's his name? Kennefeld? Yeah, he's doing research on cyber proxies too. So I'm excited about the new generation of scholars, and I think cyber proxies is a key aspect that you've hit on that I think a lot of people will be doing research on in the future.
Trey?
That's interesting. It's the first time I've heard the Chinese development of network infrastructure in Africa as sort of secretly a very big cyber range, but it'd be an interesting thing to track down. I think you've already seen them integrated into the development cycle, right? The Russians have almost certainly used criminal groups as R&D labs for some of their kit, and that the way the Chinese are organized sort of sits already, and it's maybe a network of proxies, or maybe it's a sort of federated organization, but In terms of the use of new capabilities, it's not clear yet. I don't know that we've seen a lot of really great examples, but it certainly seems feasible. There's a lot of interest around attribution and a lot of attendant complexities that come when you're the state that's done something. So I think it's an area for growth. There's some good young research. I think also Tim Maurer at the Carnegie Institute has been doing some stuff on this. Yeah.
Marcus, do you want to comment on this?
Yeah, I could agree and add maybe that it's the main problem we did not really touch in this discussion is the attribution problem, and which is actually also a big thing in arms control, as we heard in I think your talk. It's not easy if someone produces a cyber weapon, gives it to someone else, and then the other one is using it. You never know who is the player in this playground at the moment. So that's why I think the perspective must always be from the side of the victim, and we must abstract from the question actually who's behind the attack.
Mm-hmm. There was a question there. Okay, you already have the mic. Yeah.
So Carlos Vega with the Army Cyber Institute. And I have a couple of questions for Brandon. You talk about the arms race, and it's implied that it's offensive and military weaponry. Yet you use DHS as an example in your data. DHS is not offensive, they're defensive, and they're a response to attacks, not anything on the offensive side. So how are you bridging that gap of cyber arm race with that data set? That's number one. Number two, for Trey, you closed your presentation with policy recommendations, and you discussed very well the challenges with policy that it has in this field right now. But you don't cover what the market is doing. So what we see right now when large data sets are compromised, companies like a large communication company based out of the United States saw that their data set has been compromised. They were first to buy it to reduce its value. So what you see is they're trying to increase the cost of a hack and decrease the return on investment. And as opposed to right now, it's such a low cost and the return is so high, you can be wrong 1,000 times, 1,000,000 times, but you only have to be right once. What do you think policy is really going to address what the market is trying to correct now?
Thank you. So first question for Brandon.
Yeah.
I guess you have to find creative ways on how to measure the buildup.
To be clear though, when we construct the final empirical index, it will include defense, offense, and technological spending. I think this is what the final index would include. So we definitely do need to include defense, and I think that's an important characteristic that a lot of people are kind of forgetting that needs to be categorized and coded. So that would be a clear kind of goal for us to do. So that's why we use DHS money, because we don't just include offense. And of course, cyber is just not about the offense. And I think a real important question, empirical question, would be that how are we reacting to cyber threats? Are we actually preparing for the defense, or are we just focused on the offense? And a lot of evidence so far shows that we're not properly reacting in terms of escalating defensive capabilities, which would be the prudent reaction if you are threatened in the cyber sphere.
Mm-hmm. So I think the question about the private sector is a good one, and I don't do enough to address it in this deck. But two responses. The first is there's a distinction to be made between the tools themselves and the end product. So LinkedIn denying benefit to these attackers by buying up a big but very old data set of crappy passwords and LinkedIn usernames does start to attack the end of the value chain for them by targeting the end product, the results of exploitation and compromise. But I think that it does very little to protect them proactively, and that while there are absolutely places where companies are playing at the very edge of the market to try and understand the capabilities and the products that are being developed against them or being potentially stolen from them, to interdict that, it's still a latent space. It's still an undeveloped space, excuse me. But the second answer is this. It is fundamentally a private sector response for a lot of this, because this market is primarily composed of the source of a lot of these goods are the software vendors themselves. We can have a great discussion about what supply in this market looks like, but I think fundamentally it comes down to the victims themselves and their security posture, which is largely the private sector, and then the vendors and their products, which is largely the private sector. Certainly we care about the capabilities that are being deployed against public sector groups and against the government, but fundamentally the supply side is largely determined by these private sector groups, and so understanding and improving their risk management process and understanding and improving their information assurance process is critical here. And I think that's why focusing on the larger ecosystem at play, it's both defensive and offensive, and not just at the capabilities themselves, is why it's important.
Are there any other questions? Yeah. Jason here in the front.
Thank you. It really struck me, and I guess I'm aiming this, well, Trey, because it's a Harvard question, but also probably Brandon again. It really struck me as something that I heard Joe Nye say once, and that this is one of the few, this is maybe the only kind of conflict where one side can disarm another side. In traditional arms control, you can only disarm yourself by, taking the warhead off the missile, destroying the missile. Here, if you disclose vulnerabilities to the vendor, if you don't keep the 0 day from yourself, you're not just disarming yourself because you can't use that capability. Now you're taking that capability away from everybody else in the space. And to me, that was a really, I thought, fundamentally important point if you're thinking about arms control and stopping arms races, is that one side can disarm every other player that's in this space. So I'm just kind of curious on comments on that thought and ways. Do you think that's true, and what are some ways that we might be able to pull on that thought to curb cyber arms races, since that's the title of the panel?
So I think, to use another of Joe's phrases, right, there is a complex interdependence in this system of actors, where we're relying on common information to develop very disparate capabilities, both defensive and offensive. I want to exploit my network. I'm looking for largely the same information as an attacker is attempting to gain access. So I think in a lot of cases, or in a lot of instances, that's true, although it's not as binary or dyadic as it would be in the traditional arms control sense. I can't push a button and remove my nukes and disable those of Russia as well, partly in this instance because there are so many actors working at different timescales and at different levels of capability. So while I may disclose something to the vendor, that might be a signal to somebody else that they've got a narrow time window in which to use their capability before the vendor gets there. And I think a lot of times when we're talking about the patching process, our mental model is highly capable software vendors, those for whom the patching process is a facet of software development and has been that way for 5 or 10 years. But what's going to become increasingly important are industrial control system companies that maybe don't have that same software development security maturity, for whom patching is both a major pain in the ass, right, for the products that they're developing, but also a really novel concept for the tools that they're selling. And you could go even farther with that with embedded systems and IoT companies. Your thermostat vendor, right, may not have ever thought about patching before until that first attack. And so, yes, I think that sort of mutual disarmament is potentially useful here as a model, but it's difficult because there's a range of actors and a range of ability levels. But the other quick thought on that is this. It's not enough necessarily just to be able to restrict the use of a single tool or capability. And I think part of the problem is that the density of vulnerabilities is such that, and Dan Geer proposed this, I think, 2014 in Black Hat, basically, let's go out and buy all the bugs. We've got money, right? We've got lawyers, guns, and money. Let's go out and just buy everything we can find and let's take them off the market. The problem with that is twofold. First, it reduces the amount of focus that you have, not just on bugs, but on bug classes, right? And trying to innovate defensively as opposed to just sort of find holes in existing products. So it doesn't really force you to think differently or to improve your software development process, the SDLC or whatever technique you're using. But the second is it concentrates a lot of effort into taking advantage of a system without changing it. So we presume that this life cycle and this ecosystem is a necessary sort of emergent property of the system. It can't be changed. But I think in a lot of these discussions, we're starting to hit on facts that it can. Right? We can start to alter the life cycle of this information in a way that may be more fundamental than just buying at one end of it or trying to solve at the other end of it. And I think where that really comes through is that we're talking about more than just vulnerabilities. We need to address payloads and propagation techniques as well, and those cannot be bought up and sort of mutually disarmed in that same way. I may disclose all of the payloads that I've developed. It takes nothing away from the Russians or the Chinese or a non-state group. So while exploits are critical, they're only part of the puzzle. I think that's why that sort of tripartite component model has some utility.
If I may just quickly add, you made an excellent point actually, because this is actually the core argument. That's what we brought this example of our future advanced trusted environment up. This is about not disarming ourselves. This is about disarming everyone. So because we simply take this exploit-based cyber weapon class out of the game. maybe this has not been fully understood.
And I think, what you point to and what Joe points to, this is what's so fundamentally interesting about the cyber domain, is that there's a benefit to cooperation, that there's a necessary impulse towards restraint because of the devastation that can happen if we use these weapons for dramatic effect. And that's what's so different about cyber, but we tend to use the same sort of concepts and the same sort of language, and Sean Lawson talks a lot about this, and this becomes so problematic, using the term cyber bombs, cyber missiles. We're leading ourselves in the wrong direction, and we need to fundamentally think of new theories and the new dynamics that are brought on by digital connectivity, and not rely on age-old wisdom that doesn't necessarily apply to this domain.
Thank you. I think time is running out rather quickly. Just as a final closing remarks to you, I'll just ask you, how do you see the future developing? Do you see more of this cyber arms dynamic? Do you see some of these technical methods changing the whole debate in some ways, as Markus has suggested? Or will we see like a calm down period at some point? Or what do you see?
Well, I think one thing is that fundamentally there have been reactions in cyberspace in terms of after Stuxnet we saw a decline of activity, and I think there is this fear of what can happen if the worst is unleashed. But of course bad states will do bad things, and this will continue. This is the age-old wisdom all the way back to the beginning of time, and we need to fundamentally realize that there are root causes to conflict, and it's not a root cause that's led to by cyber. Is that we need to think about how to settle disputes between states so we can move forward. And we're going to see bad things happen when states disagree over fundamental, indivisible issues. And this is why a lot of conflicts are linked to traditional issues, not new cyber, internet, digital issues.
Markus?
Yeah, I could quote again, I have a dream. But
I knew you're an optimist.
there is a real chance actually that we could maybe one day overcome all the zero-day problem, this malware problem. This will but be a faraway future indeed. The thing, what we heard at this conference so far is a lot of a plea from the cyber commanders to go more into active cyber defense. There is this plea to intensify research. There is this plea to intensify cooperation. All of this may be true and may be useful. We should not forget one thing. The internet was created to bring forward mankind, and at the moment being, it is a kind of wild, wild west from the legal perspective, from the technical perspective. And yeah, I have the dream that we get internet under control and make it a safe place for a nice future for mankind.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Very, very clever.
It's beautiful. That's why we're here. I mean, it's funny, but it's also, I think it is why we're here, right? And so I would push back a little, and I'd say, in fact, I hope we don't get it under control, because I think that the processes that we're starting to see evolve is a transition towards a state-oriented governance process and security, and not that potentially threatens this sort of emergent capacity, this intellectual vivacity, and this architectural diversity that has characterized the internet since its inception. It's primarily a grassroots product, and it has developed these informal mechanisms of control that are formalizing over time and hardening over time, and that reduces or lengthens the innovation cycle, and it reduces the access to information into sort of novel, interesting ideas that I think is what's at the core of why we're here and why the security of this space is interesting. In terms of what I see, I think unfortunately there is this hardening process that's happening, and the language of proliferation is starting to replace the export controls dialogue, which is potentially useful, but is still driven in a very national security-oriented framework that hasn't been thoroughly fleshed out as to what exactly we're attempting to do yet. And what could well come of that is a sort of bear stumbling through the China shop situation, where we're going to break a lot of valuable relationships, sort of key areas of expertise, good sort of communities of interest that have been doing a lot of good work on security in this attempt to get to some ill-defined national security-oriented goal. But I think the second thing is and this is maybe what gives us, or gives me anyway, hope, there's a lot of change afoot. GM this year announced a bug bounty program, United the year before for their website. I think we're starting to see companies and more traditionally hidebound institutions adopt effective security tools and techniques and processes, and that's a really encouraging thing. It may very well lead to some of these structural changes in the way we build and buy software that will make it more secure and potentially could put us eventually into that era where we're sort of post-vulnerability. I mean, at the root of this, arms control really is, or an arms race is probably bad language, but it describes an adversarial kind of competitive development process, an iterative development process, and that's at the heart of what we're talking about with security, right? These may not be arms, and we not necessarily be racing, but we are offense and defense constantly competing to find that next novel technique, that next novel innovation. So I hope that we will continue to see progress at kind of fueling that fire and fueling that innovation.
So again, and I think we all agree that research is one of the main solutions driving these solutions. From my side, thank you very much. A round of applause to excellent panelists. And some herbs to you as well. Thank you for coming.